Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here, joining you today to talk about perhaps the most popular and well-refined game in the entirety of the Street Fighter series. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is the fifth iteration and perhaps the most polished edition of the legendary Street Fighter franchise. With so many upgrades and re-releases of what is essentially just Street Fighter 2, the history behind this game can get a tad confusing at times, especially when you take into account the ludicrous amounts of ports that this entry in the series received. It is not quite as simple as an arcade version followed by a Sega Saturn and Playstation release with this one. So with this in mind, this is the confusing history of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and its many ports. Yeah! To understand Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, we first have to fully understand how we got to this game in the first place. As stated just a moment ago, the title was the fifth iteration of Street Fighter 2. So let us run through a quick timeline of events looking at how we reached this point. The first version of the classic one-on-one fighting game from February 1991 would feature 8 playable characters, along with an additional 4 boss characters to face off with at the end of the game. These were known as Grand Masters. The game was ported to a number of systems, with the most famous version being the one on the Super Nintendo. An upgraded version of the title would hit arcades in 1992, known as Street Fighter 2 Champions Edition. The largest change to the game was that it would give the player the ability to play as the 4 Grand Masters, increasing the playable roster up to 12 different characters. This version of the game would famously end up being ported to the Mega Drive after the 1-year console exclusivity deal had expired for Street Fighter 2 with Nintendo. The third version of the game was known as Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting, and was amusingly created in response to a bootleg version of the game known as Rainbow Edition that had sped up the Street Fighter gameplay. Capcom noticed the increased playability this gave the game, and as a result increased the play speed of their game and gave some players special moves. Street Fighter 2 Turbo would be released on the Super Nintendo, promptly crushing the fact that the Mega Drive had just received Champions Edition. In September 1993, we would see the release of Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers, which saw perhaps the most significant changes to the game we had seen yet. The first of these changes would see the game moved over from the Capcom System 1 arcade board to the more advanced and more powerful Capcom System 2 board. The new hardware would assist Capcom in allowing them to make both graphical and audio upgrades to the game. But even more excitingly, they would increase the character roster up to 16 with the addition of 4 new challengers. Most impressively, this was not even the game's final form, as this now brings us on to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo The Ultimate Championship. February 1994 would see the last 90s iteration of Street Fighter 2 and the very subject of this video, which like its predecessor also ran off of Capcom System 2 hardware. The game featured multiple new play mechanics in addition to those it had inherited from previous versions of Street Fighter 2. Changes also included all stages and character portraits receiving new graphics. The game also featured a brand new intro sequence featuring Ryu, Cammy, Chun-Li, but most importantly the 17th edition and newest member of the Street Fighter 2 roster, Akuma. Speaking of Akuma, he functions as the title's first ever secret character, a tradition that will continue across a number of other Capcom fighting games. In Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Akuma features as a secret end boss for players who manage to make their way all the way to M Bison without losing a continue, achieving a high score, and getting to the end of the game in under 25 minutes. When these feats are achieved, Akuma will warp in just before your battle with Bison, and then dispose of him, functioning as a final boss encounter in his place. It is notable that during this fight, Akuma has no name on his life gauge, and his portrait is completely black. The music also changes on the stage to Akuma's theme, overall adding an air of mystery to this encounter for those who would have been new to the game. This can be a tough fight, as Akuma has increased abilities to that of other players in the game, and as a result can throw multiple mid-air Hadoukens at once, for example. On top of this, Akuma is also a playable character, who can be unlocked by entering a code on the character select screen. However, the playable version of this character is much weaker than the CPU end boss counterpart, resulting in him having lower attack strength and stamina. On top of this, he also only has the ability to throw one mid-air Hadouken. On top of the addition of Akuma, and changes to the character portraits and stage backdrops, a number of new animation frames were drawn and added for the characters themselves. Additional victory poses were added and new animations were introduced for both basic and special moves. For example, Chun-Li received a brand new animation for her fireball projectile attack. The sound effects and music for the game were also completely remade for this title, which would include a new announcer and new voice samples for certain characters. Prior to the release of this game, Super Street Fighter 2, the new challengers, had been criticised on multiple occasions for being slow in comparison to that of 2 Turbo. So, as a result, this game would feature adjustable speed settings prior to a playthrough, catering to those who like either of the game's speeds. Now, let us talk about arguably the most impactful changes that this game introduced to Street Fighter 2 players, the actual fighting game mechanics themselves. The game would include the Super Combo, which is a type of special move, which packs more of a punch than the character's regular special move. These Super Combos can only be performed depending on how full the player's Super Combo gauge is. These Super Combos can be performed by inputting specific commands, much like any attack in Street Fighter really. Once performed, the gauge will reduce back to 0, and if victory is achieved during one of these attacks, the background will flash red and yellow in psychedelic electric polygon glory. The game also features air combos, which are achievable when the player launches an opponent into the air via the first hit of a combo. Once the opponent is propelled upwards, an air combo can be performed when continuing to attack the enemy during the duration of the jump. With regards to this, it is a nice touch that lighter characters can remain in the air longer, as a result allowing for longer air combo moves. The game is remembered today as perhaps the most refined and polished rendition of Street Fighter 2, and as a result has always been a staple game amongst the competitive fighting game community. The title was featured at the Evolution Championship Series from 2002 to 2008 and was only superseded at a later date by even newer renditions of Street Fighter 2, which we shall discuss in later videos. The game has been continuously praised and celebrated to this very day, with Arcade Sushi, for example, ranking the title as the best fighting game of all time, stating it is easily the most loved and most played game in the franchise. If you haven't played this fighter, then you haven't played fighting games at all. With all this said, that brings us on to the next portion of the video, where we move away from the arcade version of the game and begin to look at the title's many ports. Just to be clear today, we are going to solely focus our attention towards the direct ports of the original arcade game, as opposed to the rearranged version of the title that would appear at much later dates in time. Besides, I could easily discuss all of those in depth in separate videos on here, looking at the history of Street Fighter 2 moving into the 21st century. So for now, let us stick just to discussing direct ports of the game. Yeah! To begin our journey into the world of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo ports, we first have to turn our attention to the 3DO, as this was the first ever system to receive a home port of this game. In fact, the 3DO is the very reason I have decided to tackle this topic today, as this video functions as part of a trilogy I am making looking at various events within 3DO history. If you're yet to watch it, I strongly advise you to check out my upload from a few days ago covering the Robo 3DO, a system that was produced specifically to be experienced in Japanese love hotels. Ooh. It is yet to receive many views thus far, so it makes me sad that so many people are missing out, so please go give it a look. Anyway, focusing back on Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the game would never make it to 16-bit machines at all, and instead would first arrive on 32-bit hardware, with the 3DO being the first of the lot. The 3DO port would arrive on the scene firstly in Japan in November of 1994 and would quickly arrive in North America and Europe shortly after. In theory, bearing in mind the raw power of the 3DO hardware at the development team's disposal, was this the best home version of Street Fighter 2 yet? Let us discuss. In this port of the game, the graphics were definitely more faithfully recreated on 3DO hardware than with any Street Fighter 2 port that had been seen on 16-bit hardware previously. These sprite animations certainly look rather fantastic. Sadly though, this version of the game does not support parallax scrolling, so the backgrounds are rather still in this iteration of the game. Whilst the character animations do look great as well, they are still missing some animation frames in comparison to the game's arcade counterpart. Loading times are very good for a game that is found using CD-ROM based media, however loading can sometimes slow the game down when performing more elaborate moves. The music in this one is absolutely fantastic and miles ahead of any Street Fighter 2 soundtrack that had ever been heard on any home console of the period. Amusingly though, as great as this is, the 3DO version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo was not the first home game to feature this soundtrack, as it was in fact ported over to the 3DO from the FM Towns computer home version of Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers, a game worth looking at if we ever go into depth looking at that iteration in the series. As you are probably aware, the 3DO only featured 3 fire buttons on the right hand side of the controller, making it a fairly limited joypad for experiencing a Street Fighter game. For this reason, Capcom would release a controller specifically for playing this game on the system, which would also be released on the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive for owners of older Street Fighter 2 games. So all in all, was this the best home version of Street Fighter 2 the world had ever seen yet? Well, it is certainly up for debate. The game features some of the best music and character animation found in any home title up until that point, but failed to deliver in other areas such as the addition of load times and the loss of parallax scrolling. A strong case can certainly be made for it to be the best version, but it all depends on your taste and what you value most from a Street Fighter 2 experience. The 3DO port received mostly praise at the time, with EGM praising the game for its graphics, content and controls, going as far to call it near perfect, even when using the 3-button 3DO controller. GamePro on the other hand stated the control is imperfect, even with a 6-button controller, and is terrible with the standard pad due to the mushy D-pad. They would go on to say the game is a reasonably close translation of the coin-op, but falls second to the SNES version of Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting among Street Fighter 2 conversions, which once again echoes back to my earlier point about different strokes for different folks when it comes to this port. In regards to this, Next Generation 2 would criticise the 3DO controller, but declared it without a doubt the best version of Street Fighter 2 to hit home systems. Ultimate Future Games loved the game so much that they gave the 3DO version a 95% score, hailing it as a game that was saved for 3DO. If only Ultimate Future Games had have been correct in their judgment, as the 3DO definitely deserves a little more attention than it ultimately received. Okay, so we have looked at the original arcade version, along with its decent port to the 3DO. Next in line for the game was a port to Microsoft DOS for PC users. So how was the PC Master Race's serving of Street Fighter goodness? Let us take a look. The PC port of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, developed by Eurocom, appears to run great, and was definitely the best PC version of Street Fighter 2 to be released to the world yet. I for one am very impressed with this port of the game, especially when you consider no one seems to ever talk about this one at all. If you look closely though, you can see one glaring difference between this game and the one found on the 3DO and in the arcade, and that is the screen has been resized, making the sprites look much bigger and the stages smaller looking as a result, making this version a little more claustrophobic feeling than other ports of the game. With this game, it suffers from other minor issues which are usually experienced when porting an arcade game, such as less animation frames and things of that ilk. I also do not feel the music arrangements in this game are quite as good as those found on the 3DO or in the arcade, but still very decent. All in all, this is an impressive PC game. Next up, the game was released for the Amiga CD32, another early entry into the 32-bit home console marketplace, predating that of the 3DO. The system also used CD-ROM based software, so with this in mind, you would once again expect something fairly special, or at least a game that is more technically impressive in some ways than Street Fighter games found on the Super Nintendo or the Mega Drive. When it comes to this game, the first warning signs are in plain sight when it comes to the game's cover art itself. The cover all around looks goofy and ridiculous, featuring both DJ and Akuma with cheesy grins, and the bottom portion of the artwork featuring unnecessary Michael Bay-like explosions for extra effect. This all gives the player a sense of what is about to come when inserting the game into the system. This version of the game, developed by GameTech, is absolutely dreadful. It is difficult to attempt to defend this atrocity in any way. I suppose the graphics are close to the arcade version and the remix soundtrack is acceptable, but the animations are so jerky and the game is missing so many frames that it is in a state of being almost unplayable. To top this off, the load times between matches are unbearably long as well. Further to this, just to let you know that this game would not come out until 1996, a year by which point that anyone with a bit of sense would have already upgraded their hardware to either a Sega Saturn or PlayStation, or even just stuck with the SNES or Mega Drive. I seriously doubt that many people would have ever actually experienced this abomination of a game. It seems to be such trash that most publications never even bothered to review it at the time. So sadly, I cannot even provide you with some critical response for us to all laugh at when it comes to this port of the game. What a shame, eh? Ports of the game would also eventually make it over to the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, the two more favourable 32-bit systems of the period. These pieces of newer hardware would not receive the game until 1997, as part of a compilation title known as Street Fighter Collection. This game would debut across both platforms and would feature Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers, Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold, which would add Cammy to the Street Fighter Alpha 2 roster, and last but certainly not least the subject of this video, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. As expected from these systems, these ports were perhaps the most arcade accurate renditions of the game yet. This was after all 3 years after the game's initial arcade release. Despite this though, the games are still not perfect, and both suffer from minor processing glitches here and there. This can result in unresponsive controls when in close quarter combat. Another minor issue is that the game features a bug that allows Guile to throw 2 sonic boom projectiles at once. But I guess this can be seen as an amusing quirk if you are not a total fighting game purist. The music comes in on each stage slightly later than it does on the arcade version, which is apparently due to the limitations of playing a game using CD-ROM based media. When it comes to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo on these platforms, it was better late than never, I suppose. Despite there never being a standalone version of the game on either the Saturn or PlayStation, amusingly, the Dreamcast would receive one another 3 years on in the year 2000. Now 6 years removed from the game's arcade release. This version of the game would only see a release in Japan though, hence why most of you watching today will probably not remember the release of this one. The game in Japan featured a different name to the rest of the world, and instead was known as Super Street Fighter 2 X, or maybe Cross, or even Kiss. As expected from the powerful Dreamcast hardware, the game was even more arcade accurate than that of the PlayStation or Saturn version of the game. On top of that, there are arguably enough changes to this version of the game to classify it as a completely rearranged version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. But I guess the game still holds enough in common with the arcade original to just enough be considered as a port. In this version, the more powerful, previously CPU only controlled version of Akuma can actually be unlocked and played as, who features all of the boosted stats and the ability to shoot multiple Hadoukens mid-air. There is even a third version of Akuma in this one who can use the Raging Demon technique as a super combo. Bonus rounds that were absent from the arcade version of this game that had been part of previous Street Fighter 2 games also made a return to this slightly enhanced port. This game in Japan was only ever available by mail order, but remains infamous as it allowed players to have matches online for the first time. using the abilities of the Dreamcast modem. All in all, resulting in this port of the game taking huge step forwards for Street Fighter II overall. Another 5 years later, in 2005, the game would appear on both the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox for the first time, as part of a compilation disc known as Capcom Classic Collection 2. In this version, there is nothing exciting to report here really, and the game featured multiple speed hiccups and glitches. Finally, this brings us up until present day, with the game seeing a release on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One and Nintendo Switch as part of the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection that saw a release in 2018. This fantastic anthology features the title among 12 other Street Fighter games and has been ported almost arcade perfectly to modern hardware. All in all, making this a great compilation, allowing users to experience multiple Street Fighter classic games at a cheap price point. To summarise this video, there is nothing quite like the arcade original of Super Street Fighter II Turbo. However, various ports have impressed for different reasons throughout the game's 25-year existence. The 3DO was the first ever console to allow users to bring this game home, and the system did a fine job of allowing users to have fun with this game from the comforts of their living room less than a year after the game's initial arcade release. 6 years later, the Dreamcast would feature the release of the game too, and was the closest and most arcade perfect version of the game yet, even featuring a few enhancements and online play. But to be fair, if you want to take this game home today, the 2018 release for modern hardware is certainly both the best and cheapest way to experience the game. If I was going to leave you with just one piece of advice for today, it would be to simply avoid the Amiga CD32 version at all costs. Yeah. Anyway, that was the confusing history of Super Street Fighter II Turbo and its many ports. I feel we have not even seen the last of this game yet, as it appears to just keep coming back time and time again. If you enjoyed today's content, please like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss a video. Please leave me some of your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section down below. Finally, to conclude this video, my channel Top Hat Gaming Man is funded by the fantastic support I receive from my Patreon supporters, who really do relieve an element of stress from my life and help encourage me to get videos out to you multiple times a week. So a huge thank you and a massive shout out to Carl Johnson, JD Robbins, Seabass the Great, Synth Spaces, Andrew Bazansky, Edward O'Reilly, Quang DX, SpudsMatt B, Michael Baker, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins and all of my other patrons. Thank you all for improving and changing my life.